I'm going to turn now to the Gospel of John. We've been spending a good deal of time in this Gospel over the past 3 weeks. And that Ephesus passage actually brings out a little bit of the story. In this story, Jesus talks about being the light of the world, but there's so much more to it than that. This is actually John chapter 9, the entire chapter. So instead of reading the chapter to you and then talking about it, I'm going to do like I did last week. I'm going to go bit by bit, reading a little bit of the passage, and then talking about it while it's fresh in our heads. Listen again for the word of our Lord. Well, before I begin reading, let's give a little bit of background. Last week we were talking about Jesus and a woman at the well, at Jacob's well. That was way back in chapter 4 of the Gospel according to John. And a lot has happened between chapter 4 and chapter 9. Jesus has done a lot in that time he is gone, and he has healed people. He has taught people. He has fed the 5,000. And just before the chapter we're about to read, Jesus has finished teaching in the temple where he talked about his true disciples and what it means to be his disciples. He said that his true disciples would be those that continue in his word. For they will know the truth, and the truth will set them free. That's a popular saying that we hear time and time again, quoted, "The truth will set you free." Jesus goes on to explain that the truth will set you free from sin. And he begins to have a rather lengthy debate with the Pharisees about sin, which ends up leading them to almost stoning him to death. They are ready to stone him. And so he leaves the temple. That is where our story picks up today. Jesus he's on his way from the temple when he encounters a man who has been blind since birth. Begin in verse 1. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind, so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground, and he made mud with his saliva, and he spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back, able to see. It's interesting to note that the disciples, they see this situation where they come upon a man who has been blind since the day he was born. And the first thing that comes to their mind, the first thing they begin to ask about, is they begin to wonder about sin. Who sinned? Why is this man being punished in this way with blindness? That's what they saw it as. In that day and time, they believed that everybody got what they deserved. And if something bad happened in your life, if you got sick, if you had some terrible disease, if you were blind, it must have been because of something bad you had done. And they also thought that if something good happened in your life, if you were healthy, if you were happy, if you were rich, they thought that was because it was something good that you had done. That may sound kind of odd to us today in a day and age when we understand science and we know a thing or two about germs and diseases. But even today, there are still people that when they hear they have cancer or some other dreadful disease, They wonder what they did to deserve it and why God would cause this to happen. Have you ever heard somebody say that before and ask that question? And then there's those that look at natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis and bad storms, and they believe that even those dreadful situations are the result of something that they did, or they believe that something went wrong and God is punishing them or those people. But that couldn't be any further from the truth. That is not the truth. That's not the heart and mind of God. For when Jesus looks at this situation, he doesn't see sin or sinner. In fact, he says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He states it right there in the front. This isn't about sin. Who did wrong? Who messed up? But instead, he sees this as an opportunity to glorify God by showing the heart and mind of God, by showing compassion and healing the man. The blindness isn't God's glory. The blindness isn't God's presence, God's heart and mind. The healing is. And Jesus invites his disciples to open their eyes and to see the truth, to see the true glory of God, the true presence of God, the truth about who God is and what God wants. We continue on in verse 8 now. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." In this section, we can see the man is healed now. This is a time to celebrate, a time for all the world to see the glory of God, starting with the blind man's neighbors. The people who were right there around him. People who saw him day in and day out. A time to celebrate the glory of God. Not right now, Joe. But instead of celebrating, they're cynical. You get that? They don't want to believe that this could have happened. That this young man could truly be the same person that they passed all the time, back and forth through the city gate. And to some degree, they're right. He's not the same person. Maybe he's smiling now instead of frowning all the time. Maybe he's giddy with joy instead of being down and depressed like he was when they saw him begging at the city gate. I can see why they would be confused, but instead of believing the man who is healed, they end up taking him away. They take him to the authorities for them to sort it out. And they miss it. They miss God's presence. They miss the glory of God in all of this. We're going to continue on and now in verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes that he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." Again, the people of God are given the opportunity to celebrate something wonderful that has happened in their midst. Something that reveals God's glory. Something that reveals who God truly is and what God truly values in this world. God's heart, God's mind. And instead, they focus on how it occurred and how it didn't follow protocol. You see, since no work was to be done on the Sabbath, the people of God had taken a great deal of time to define for themselves what constituted work so that they did not do work on the Sabbath. Making mud, as Jesus did with his hands, would have constituted work. Healing, when it's not a life-threatening situation, constituted work for them. Even using saliva to heal with, which was actually a common medicine in that day and age. I know we don't think of it today that way. You spit in somebody's eye and they're not going to think that way. But in that day and time, saliva was seen as a medicine. And it was seen as something to be strictly forbidden on the Sabbath. It was work. You know, in that day and age, if a person broke their arm, you couldn't have it set on the Sabbath. If you broke your ankle, you couldn't even pour cold water over it to soothe it, because that was work on the Sabbath. They believed that that was the will of God. They thought that in that day and time. And Jesus was making them feel very uncomfortable. Certainly, healing is important, but for them, it had to do with how it was done, and in particular, when it was done. And because of that, they failed to see God's presence in all of this. They failed to be able to celebrate it, to see what good was there. They failed to see the light. We continue on in verse 18 now. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents actually said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." The Pharisees are sounding a lot like the neighbors at this point, somewhat cynical, not believing that this could be true, that this is actually the same man who was at the gate, or perhaps that this man was never blind in the first place. So they called in the parents to testify to the truth of what happened. And so they say that this is their son, and they say, yes, he was blind from birth. But they won't say a word about how it happened. And why are we told in Scripture that they won't tell anything about it? How it happened? They're afraid of being excommunicated. It's important to realize that in that day and age, excommunication didn't mean you were just kicked out of the synagogue, that you couldn't worship there anymore. But it actually meant that you were kicked out of the kingdom. Your property, which was seen as a gift from God, could be confiscated. And you were banned. You were shunned, is a better word for it. no longer seen as a member of their society. So instead of celebrating what has been done and the glory of God and God's presence in all of this, they tremble in fear and they pass the buck. They pass the responsibility of the answer on to their son. They miss it. They miss the opportunity to see the glory of God. Continue on, verse 24. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, I now see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him. They abused him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man was astounded. "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone who opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins and are trying to teach us." And they drove him out. They kicked him out. They excommunicated him. At this moment, we see the Pharisees no longer open to the truth, but intent upon exercising their power. They are blinded. Blinded by pride, blinded by arrogance into believing that only they could be right and that God could not be doing a new thing. And so they try to threaten the man who is healed into recounting his testimony and into saying, "No, I was wrong. That's not how it happened." But the man stands by what he said. He stands by the truth of God's glory that has been revealed to him, even to the point that he begins to argue back with the Pharisees, to the point that he is then kicked out of the synagogue. He is now homeless. He is peopleless. He is no longer accepted as a member of society. You know, if you do some digging, you'll realize that he never really was a part of society. As a blind man, he would have been cut off from the community, and especially from the synagogues and the temples and the holy places. And so when he is finally healed, you can imagine the excitement. He can finally become a part of the society, a regular part. He can finally be reunited not only with the community, but with the place of worship. And in that day and age, they would have thought that that meant he was reconciled with God. He was right with God. But just as quickly as that hope is lit, it disappears, and he's once again on the outside, looking in. All because he would not tell a lie. Because he was intent on telling the truth about what God had done. Our final section starts with verse 35. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking to you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, surely we are not blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sinned, but now that you say we see, your sin remains. What strikes me the most about this last part of the story is that when this man is kicked out, he is kicked out of everything for simply telling the truth. Everyone has turned their back on him. Even the people of God. It is Jesus himself who seeks him out. And who shows him the truth yet again about God. About God's heart and mind. And how it is for that man who is healed. So much so that Jesus sought him out and praised him. And the glory of God continues to be revealed to him. He sees that God is not far from him. From the beginning of the story, all the way toward the end. There's a common thread that I believe ties this entire story together, and I've kind of hit that nail on the head several times. The glory of God. And as some might say, the recognition of the presence of God and the truth about who God really is. Who God really is. And the one person who consistently sees God's presence is the blind man. And in this story, we see how hard it is to bear that truth and to share it. His neighbors are cynical. And others, like the Pharisees, are outraged over what he shares. And when you think about it, not much has changed over time. Even today, it's hard to share with others where we have seen God at work, where we have experienced God's presence in our lives. How many times do you walk through a grocery store or walk down the street or bump into friends and they can't wait to share with you an experience that they had with God? It's not as common. Much like that blind man from long ago, I believe we are each here today in this place because we are open. We are open to seeing the glory of God, to seeing God at work in our world, to experience God's presence, to give God glory in this place. But as much as we seek to glorify God and enjoy God's presence in our lives, we all stumble from time to time. As much as we would like to be like the blind man, it's hard to be so once we leave this place. Sometimes we can actually fall prey to being just like the neighbors. And we can become cynical. Cynical about the way that people experience the glory of God. Cynical about those who are sharing about it. Or just like the Pharisees, hating to be made uncomfortable. Maybe even being a little too prideful or puffed up in our knowledge when people don't act or do things in the proper way, or the way that we're used to, or would like them to be done. We're all challenged from time to time to glorify God and enjoy God's presence in our lives forever, as our confessions of faith state that we should do. The truth is, like the blind man, we all have things that we are blind to. We all have ways in which we are broken, and we all have ways in which we are in need of being healed. We all are in need of Jesus to help us to see the truth about God and experience it for ourselves. But like the blind man, we also need to be open to sharing those experiences with others and allowing others to share their experiences with us. Perhaps in doing so, we become the instruments of God and once again reflect the light of God and the truth of who God is and what God is doing in our world. A world in need of seeing and believing. May it be so. Till God's kingdom comes and God's will is done in all its fullness. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.